Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Atheist and epigrammatist and cultural critic George Santayana, who lived from 1863 to 1952, will bring us home with his Dialogues in Limbo, first published in 1925, and then with additional dialogues in a new edition in 1948. His works would straddle the turn of the 20th century. His legacy is one of an appeal to reason, a necessary trust in our perception insofar as it leads us to functional interaction with the other people with whom we share the material plane, shades of Hume there. But he also had a soft side for religion, particularly for Catholicism, with which he maintained a close but non-devotional relationship throughout his life, very much still appreciating the aesthetics of its rituals and symbols. Santayana wrote extensive reflections on beauty, science, perception, and the cultural role of religion. Some of his most representative works are The Sense of Beauty, written in 1896, his 5-volume The Life of Reason, written between 1905 and 1906, and his 1923 work Skepticism and Animal Faith. Epiphenomenalism, the idea that conscious experience is emergent from definable material processes, as Diderot suggested in the first dialogue of his unit, and Spinozist naturalism are also associated with Santayana, both views at which Berkeley would, of course, have positively paled. Santayana was also something of a concise wit and is credited with aphorisms like, "Only the dead have seen the end of war," and "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." He had a thorough understanding of that German idealism we mentioned briefly in our Berkeley unit, but he wasn't sold on it. Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius had a lasting impact on Santayana, as Lucretius's one surviving work, De Rerum Natura, would on much of the world's intellectual currents. Democritus, whom we mentioned in an earlier unit, features in our dialogic excerpt as something of a nod to the atomism that Lucretius would advocate and for which his work would be many times censured. Santayana's affinity for the atomist philosophers is brought into some retrospective relief, since he actually lived through the first throes of the atomic age, in which the question of particle divisibility would become explosively less speculative, and in which the bomb would unfortunately come to be a sort of crass synonym for science and materialism for millions of people who mistakenly saw dispassionate technological innovation and the manufacture of apocalyptically powerful weapons as necessary outgrowths to be either celebrated or condemned of either capitalism or science without religious tempering. I like to think Santayana's lucid reflections on the interplay of inquiry and conscience, fact and predilection, if more widely or seriously engaged with, might have mitigated some of the most lasting misapprehensions of the decades that followed his passing. I won't claim to have been perfectly or even adequately forbearing and disinterested in my editorializing this whole series long. If you didn't hear it in my introductory video, by now you probably know that my heart is with the imaginative secularists and compassionate skeptics. But I have generally kept to the brief of conveying the main ideas of these thinkers directly before commenting on them, and expressing sharply critical opinions of the philosophers we have covered where opinions have crept in, even of the ones of which I am most fond, in the interest of humanizing, not idolizing them. I won't idolize now. But if you will allow me the expression of an openly favorable opinion before we say goodbye, George Santayana's The Sense of Beauty has some of the most incisive things I've ever read on aesthetics, and anyone looking for something less godly, no less elegantly put, and yet far more intelligible than Hegel's commentaries on art, might find themselves gratified by Santayana. Given the expansiveness of Santayana's imagination and his possessing of a more belletristic prose style than any of the other philosophers in our series, I offer a short litany of quotes from that work, The Sense of Beauty, some of which will be implicit in our dialogue, but others of which just give a general sense of Santayana's style and values. Along with invocations of Spinoza and Bacon's ideas, and tacitly Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the following serve not just to define aesthetics in Santayana's view, but as quite usable guiding principles for a moral, imaginative life for the materialist. Here goes. We may therefore at once assert this axiom, important for all moral philosophy and fatal to certain stubborn incoherences of thought, that there is no value apart from some appreciation of it, and no good apart from some preference of it before its absence or its opposite. In appreciation, in preference, lies the root and essence of all excellence, or as Spinoza clearly expresses it, we desire nothing because it is good, but it is good only because we desire it. Science is the response to the demand for information, and in it we ask for the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Art is the response to the demand for entertainment, for the stimulation of our senses and imagination, and truth enters into it only as it subserves these ends. From these two benefits, the practical and the imaginative, all the value of truth is derived. Aesthetic and moral judgments are accordingly to be classed together in contrast to judgments intellectual. They are both judgments of value, while intellectual judgments are judgments of fact. If the latter have any value, it is only derivative, and our whole intellectual life has its only justification in its connection with our pleasures and pains. The disinterestedness of this pleasure is, therefore, that of all primitive and intuitive satisfactions, which are in no way conditioned by a reference to an artificial general concept like that of the self, all the potency of which must itself be derived from the independent energy of its component elements. I care about myself because myself is a name for the things I have at heart. To set up the verbal figment of personality and make it an object of concern apart from the interests which were its content and substance turns the moralist into a pedant and ethics into a superstition. The self which is the object of our amour propre is an idol of the tribe and needs to be disintegrated into the primitive objective interests that underlie it before the cultus of it can be justified by reason. Of all our dialogues, this may be the one that would best work as a performance, with many descriptions of physical activity written in like stage directions, some of which you will see in action in our selection. It is in turns comical, abstruse, profound, irreverent, and poetical, and it grieved me somewhat to confine our sample only to the opening chapters. As the first two of the three characters we have included sit side by side in limbo and await the arrival of a vaguely described stranger, you may be reminded of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which would actually be written about 20 years after the first edition of Santayana's dialogues, giving its first performance a year after Santayana passed away. Dialogues in Limbo also has the happy summary feature in concluding this series of giving dialogic voice to a handful of other philosophers not otherwise represented directly within our selections. For Santayana imagines conversations, as the title would suggest, in limbo between the shades of many bygone thinkers. First, we have the oft aforesaid pre-Socratic Democritus, who along with his teacher Leucippus was among the first atomists, starting what can only be described as a millennia-long atomic reaction of debate on the nature of things. Then we have Alcibiades, Athenian statesman, speaker, and major player in the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. Alcibiades features in a couple dialogues attributed to Plato, actually including two named for him. Most prominently, he features in the banquet dialogue Symposium, which is somewhat similar to this one in that different thinkers and statesmen trade thoughts and criticism. Next, we have Aristippus, Socrates' pupil and exponent of so-called ethical hedonism. Then Dionysius the Younger, also called Dionysius II of Syracuse, who sought counsel from Plato when faced with inordinate responsibilities as ruler of Sicily before he even turned 30. Then Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, the peripatetic polymathic Islamic philosopher. Lastly, we have a man with whom we are quite acquainted, as expressed in someone else's writing, Socrates. All these hold a conference with the spirit of a stranger still living on earth. I've tried to cull selections from this 10-section dialogue that give a well-rounded impression of Santayana's body of ideas, but I'm emphasizing for the sake of continuity the first two dialogues, especially those segments featuring Democritus, Alcibiades, and the stranger who has found himself in a position to hold conference with these wraiths in limbo. Not including the Socrates section, we will avoid completely bookending the series with him, remembering him, thus not condemned to repeat him. But the later sections are very much worth a look, covering things like creative ritual, social biases, political structures, religion as a figurative framework, death and remembrance, legacy and obsolescence, art, comparative philosophies, and many other topics. One of the most interesting things glancingly covered in the section we have kept, one that follows from our sense of beauty quotes, is that beauty may be demystified as to any higher purpose, its illusions seen through, its sensory mechanics understood, and yet still exert a powerful sway on our sense of pleasure and gratification, one we needn't resist. It seems then that beauty, being an ultimately unassailable human experience, need not be spared our attempts at understanding it. Its imperishability is not a reason to remain ignorant of it, but is rather an assurance that we won't destroy its essence even when investigating it thoroughly. That is, if we are to take the stranger, being a sincere learner, as Santayana's attempt at moderating the extremities, which he no less vigorously expresses through the various philosophic shades with whom the stranger contends. Democritus also vouches for science as an instructive force that cannot itself be offended, and thus, in a way, it can actually expand the category of the beautiful. George Santayana, in this respectfully irreverent piece, demonstrates through the stranger's qualified appreciation of Plato something that I think serves all students of ideas, whether the ideas be theological, political, metaphysical, creative, or ethical, that we are allowed to be eclectic, to borrow some ideas and discard others, and most of all, we're allowed to change our minds, all without undue reverence for or detestation of the idea's progenitors. In fact, we're just as likely to be the independent sources of many of these ideas as we are to borrow them, since so many of them, whether we know it or not, get recapitulated, albeit in personal terms, anytime a human sets themselves to ponderables, whether they've read Plato or Aristotle or Berkeley or no philosophy at all. We do not need to resign, or rather, to use Santayana's term, condemn ourselves, even nominally, to sectarian commitments which disincentivize and indeed push out complication and nuance. We are under no compulsion to worship or decry these thinkers in any absolute sense, except insofar as our judgments incline us. And that goes for all prophets, historical figures, institutions, celebrities, online influencers, politicians, family, and friends. As the stranger will say, I don't mind repeating it, without deeming words sacred or ideas magical, I am a friend of both, and I wait for the flux of matter to bring them to light as it will in its infinite gyrations. Zoom already feels and looks a little bit like Limbo, and yet it is in this Limbo-based dialogue alone we have some surviving evidence of in-person human contact during these online pandemic times, since my two wonderful guest readers live together. I'm joined today by all-around theater artists and sometime collaborators Josh Miccio and Morgan Vallie, who will be reading Democritus and Alcibiades, respectively, to my stranger. Morgan is a behavior guidance specialist for Capital Area Head Start. She recently stage managed A Christmas Carol with CPHL Productions and It's a Wonderful Life at Carlisle Regional Performing Arts Center. When I first worked with her, she was serving as director of children's programming for the Hip to Hip Theater Company. Josh recently joined forces with Gettysburg Community Theater to produce their Zoom Shakespeare project, appearing in such roles as Hamlet, Cassius, and Ariel. In NYC, Josh is also a member of the Hip to Hip Theater Company, where I met both him and Morgan. He spent the holiday season appearing as George Bailey in the timeless classic It's a Wonderful Life, as well as directing a virtual live radio production of A Christmas Carol that's available through December 31st on the Pollock Center website. Santayana's dialogues in Limbo are in the public domain, and there will be a brief farewell address after the dialogue to close out our series. Thank you as always for joining us for Voluble Minds, and enjoy this fragment from Santayana's Dialogues in Limbo.
Bring the stranger! Bring the stranger! Let us see how he is put together! I smell one goodish ingredient, but the compound is newfangled. Yes, and ill-mixed.
You can't possibly scent him at this distance. Not even a dog could. For a Christian, he is rather well washed.
Before you contradict an old man, my fair friend, you should endeavor to understand him. The stranger might be as clean as a river god who cannot live out of running water, and I should not be prevented from discerning the odor of his thoughts. Did you never hear that philosophy can be smelt?
You are in your laughing mood.
Impudence! Am I a jester or a sophist like your pop-eyed Socrates? Do I study to tickle the fancy of young fops with midnight drinking bouts and myths and mock skepticism in order to confirm them in the end in all their guardroom prejudices and ignorance? No, that I am a scientific observer. Philosophies diffuse odors.
It will take a long argument to prove it.
What has argument to do with truth? True knowledge is nothing but keen sensation and faithful remembrance penetrating to that fine texture of nature which your fluent talker cannot stop to see.
Smell me, and describe my philosophy.
In your case, I can perceive nothing at this distance.
There. Is that near enough?
Now I inhale the whole perfumer's shop full of scents. But no intellect.
Has this sorry stranger, then, a stronger intellect than mine, that you can smell it a furlong off, while mine, at 3 inches, is imperceptible? I discard your philosophy, vain sage, and pronounce it a delusion.
The million have already rejected my discoveries for the same excellent reason. Their conceit is offended, and they refuse to be cured of madness by acknowledging themselves mad. As for the stranger, odoriferous virtue is not proportional to the mass of the radiating substance that his intellect need not be greater than yours merely because it carries further. A single skunk, by emitting a little fluid, will qualify space further than a herd of elephants. How many absurdities can a prejudice pack into a few words? You quote the poets as if their fictions were science. You assume that the opinions of mortals can honor or dishonor us, and you dread that life may call you back and that time may reverse and repeat itself as if it stammered. But, indeed, you are a pupil of the poets, and I must not grudge you the thrills of your fantastic tragedy.
Why may not Homer and the other poets actually have visited these regions in spirit, as the stranger is doing today? But not being philosophers, they shrank from eternity and depicted our state as shadowy and sad, whereas it is neither sadder nor merrier than material existence, but only safer, being but the truth of that existence, whatever it may have been. As for the stranger, far from disparaging our condition, he professes to envy it, and slips in thus among us whenever he is able, in order to assimilate his form of being as much as possible to ours. With some difficulty, O sage of Abdera, I have led back the stranger into your presence, because he had overheard you expressing the intention of separating him into his elements, and although the vivisection is to be of the spirit only and will not kill him, he fears it may hurt his feelings.
He deserves to suffer if he is not willing to discover how he is composed. A philosopher cannot wish to wear a mask in his own eyes or in those of the world, nor can he be ashamed of being what he is, since the scorn or the praises of men are but unsubstantial opinions, foolish and only important to themselves. And he knows that he too is a part of nature, entirely explicable and necessary.
In this, as in much else, venerable sage, I am your convinced disciple, and neither ashamed to be what I am, nor averse from knowing it. Nevertheless, there are garments which those who are not young or beautiful do well to wear, not because they wish to deceive themselves or others concerning their bodily form or infirmities, but because it is not seemly to display without necessity things not pleasing to the eye. And I fear that my thoughts in this exalted society may not seem worthy of exposure.
Be reassured. I know that Alcibiades is already your friend, and if Dionysus or Aristippus, who are frivolous wits, should mock you in an unmannerly fashion, they shall be severely rebuked and restrained by me. To the physician, the diseases which the vulgar call loathsome, and the animals which they call reptiles and worms, are all worthy of attentive study. And even if you seemed a monster to human convention, to the eye of science, you would be neither ridiculous nor unexpected.
No, but I might be commonplace and unimportant, and therefore better left in the shade.
You would not have found your way into this placid heaven if you did not love the light. And if you love the light, why should you fear it? Let me observe at once, in order to encourage you, that in one respect you are no ordinary person, since you are my disciple. Much less need you tremble before us, here who are but shades and wraiths of the thinnest atoms. We shall be grateful to you even for your vices. They will have the savor of the living world, which the gods love to inhale. And in you we shall see a specimen of the fauna, curious, if not beautiful, that flourishes today.
I am afraid that even in that capacity, I am not worth dissecting. I have been a stranger in all my dwelling places. I should hardly have strayed into this sanctuary if I had been a man of my own time.
The proper fruits and seeds of your species are lost or stunted, and it is doubtful whether mankind, smothered under its inventions and tools, will not dry up at the root and perish with them.
I do not think so. The tools and those pale men and nations that are the slaves of tools will no doubt disappear in time. Such arts have probably been invented and lost many times before. But there is a lusty core in the human animal that survives all revolutions, and when the conflagration is past, I seem to see the young hunters with their dogs camping among the ruins.
Human wit is seldom to be trusted in prophecy. The mind thinks in gaudy images, and nature moves in dark currents of molecular change, careless whether those images repeat themselves or not. Like rhymes. What is your present plight? Dispersion and impotence of soul. Here, a vein of true knowledge, there, a vestige of prudent morality, perhaps a secret love, idle political principles that alienate you from politics, a few luxurious and vapid arts, and poisoning the rest of your economy, the taint of antique superstition, for which you have no antidote. The wonder is that you exist at all, for life demands some measure of harmony.
May there not be a kind of harmony in non interference, when each circle in the state or each interest of the mind lives in its inner life apart, yet in things indifferent and external, they pull well enough together like the team of a four-horse chariot?
4 horses are by nature 4 separate bodies, which only the reins and harnesses have yoked together, whereas in a well-ordered city or in a living mind all the parts form one system by a vital necessity, unless, indeed, as seems to be the case with you, the mind or that city is not a living unit at all, but a colony. You think appearance pleasant and important, but substance you think unimportant and unpleasant. An accident which could not befall you if you had a whole soul.
I wish I might find appearance always pleasant and important, but as to substance, since the better and worse are a part of appearance, is not substance necessarily indifferent?
There is indeed no wisdom like that of the atoms, which being compelled to move by fate, move without caring whither. But when by this very motion life and will have arisen, and the foolish heart must be set on something, it is the part of a relative wisdom to set it on the truth.
Is not the truth about error a part of truth? Can the living, whose whole life is a dream, know any other part of it?
The dreamer can know no truth, not even about his dream, except by awakening out of it. If you spin one dream to explain another, as do your talking philosophers, how will you ever come out of the labyrinth?
When I was a child and learned Homer by heart, I became, so to speak, his pupil in my dreams. And that was a benefit to me, because some dreams are better than others, and Homer's are the best. The stranger has had many masters of that kind, and he may have learned the truth about them merely by comparing one with another, and, all within the realm of dreams, perceiving which was best. That is a truth about them, as it seems to me, more important than their causes.
Is the nature of truth known to you, young man, that you can tell whether the stranger, in preferring one dream to another, discerns a truth or not? Are you not both of you habitually employed in jesting and scoffing and making fanciful speeches? How many times, for once that you mention the atoms and the void, do you not mention beauty?
Beauty, as Socrates would prove to you if you would listen, is the truest of things.
Nonsense! Beauty is a fleeting appearance, and though the stranger, wiser, I admit, in this respect than either you or Socrates, knows that it is an appearance, he nevertheless cherishes it more than reality. Such is the mixture of waking and dreaming, of health and rottenness in his composition.
Can the surgeon's knife, Democritus, separate appearance from reality?
No, indeed. And I am far from blaming you for seeing the beautiful when the atoms passing in clouds before your eyes or through the ventricles of your body waft the scent of beauty upon you. It is not your fault that they do so. I, too, must see colors in the flowers and must hear the sweet warbling of the fountain or the flute. But when I see them, I mock them, and when I hear them, I remember faithfully the true causes of sound, because though I am alive and must behold appearances, I am sane and can know reality. But you, my friend, are too often delirious, and though that is a frequent accident in fever and in dreams, it is a disgrace to a professed philosopher and a nuisance to a man of sense.
I confess that sometimes the fair vision intercepts my reason, and the passers-by point at me in derision for standing amazed at nothing in particular and seeing gods in the commonest creatures. It is as if the light of sense were a divine medium on which the moving matter of things could make no other impression than to evoke their eternal forms.
I know, I know. Moonstruck in the sunshine. It is a bad symptom.
Is the circumstance of being subject to pleasant trances the only disease that you discover in the stranger?
Not at all. Out of consideration to our guest, I have begun with the least obnoxious. A philosopher cannot be subject to trances with impunity. Dwelling fondly on images, he very likely will say to himself that they are not only lovelier than substance, but somehow surer and more exalted. And who knows what metaphysical nonsense he will presently be talking about them as if inspired. Is not the stranger a disciple of Plato as well as of me?
Indeed, I am, but without contradiction. In respect to the substance and origin of things, I profess allegiance to you only. In such matters, Plato, knowing his own ignorance, was always playful, inventing or repeating such myths as he thought edifying for children or for patriots. Yet when he closed his eyes on this inconstant world, he was a great seer. I honor and follow him for what he then saw, which was a heaven of ideas rich in constellations. I disregard the trick of words or the superstitious impulse by which he added something which he certainly could not see, namely that those ideas were substances and powers ruling the world. Such a notion is not only false to the facts, but vapid in logic. Things take what shapes they can, as a poet bubbles with the words of his mother tongue, which his present passion evokes. The words chosen cannot have chosen him or created his passion. So without deeming words sacred or ideas magical, I am a friend of both, and I wait for the flux of matter to bring them to light as it will in its infinite gyrations.
Why are you displeased with a fair answer?
You may praise the meretricious muse of a Plato as much as you please, but I warn you, as a physician, that these rapturous fancies are signs of a feeble health.
Had there been some wise prophet in my day, summoning mankind to an ordered and noble life, I should gladly have followed him, not having myself the gift of leadership. I should not have asked him for the absolute truth or for an earthly paradise. I should have been content with a placid monastery dedicated to study or with a camp of comrades in the desert. But I found no master. Those who beat the drum or rang the church bell in my time were unhappy creatures, trying to deceive themselves. Better not to be a hero than work oneself up into heroism by shouting lies. Green, quiet places and boyish sports are more moralizing than these moralists. I should honor heroic virtue if it were sane and beneficent, but I find satisfaction also, and perhaps oftener, in Little things. Thank you for joining us for what I hope will just be the first series of Voluble Minds, which has now reached its end. It has been my pleasure to bring these dialogues and reflections to you with the support of the Fourth Universalist Society, and especially the encouragement of our Director of Religious Education, Ember Kelly. And I want to extend a collective thank you to all the readers who volunteered to bring these philosophers to life. You may have noticed the sort of snowball effect of accreted ideas and players as we have rolled through on a thematically packed core of the dialogic tradition. In that vein, I think George Santayana's Dialogues in Limbo is the perfect dialogue with which to end our first series, in itself a microcosmic representation of the extended universe of all these independent but interacting minds grouped under innumerable overlapping bubble galaxies of bigger and bigger stories by which they are connected, sometimes as supporting players in each other's stories or as mere references or invisible influences. And they, in turn, are a part of the even bigger story we share with them and carry on, and the story only gets bigger and bigger until it theoretically reaches something of an all, which itself we must hesitate to so call until we better understand the relationship between our universe and that unfathomable of unfathomables, infinitude. So this dialogue is more than any of the others in that it doesn't take itself too seriously and yet offers ideas no less profound, an instance of the worldly playscape, and a celebration of the human imagination, the powers from which this series, every dialogue in this series, every idea described therein, and every idea and dialogue in life is derived. Go forth and talk about it.